This video is brought to you by the wonderful folks over on my Patreon. Consider subscribing and joining one of the tiers that will allow your own double to be shown in these videos. So right off the bat, this video is going to be something a little bit different. Not to say I've really established much of a precedent as of yet, but you get the idea. I'm going to be going ahead and discussing a term that has really fallen out of vogue as of late in the historical community. That being the term Dark Ages, specifically in relation to Europe after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. And, more specifically, I'm going to bat for the term. I would like to preface though, even though a lot of my fellow YouTubers in the history community tend to decry the usage of the term Dark Ages, I'm not trying to pick a fight with anyone, just trying to give my 2 cents. If you could say I'm really comparing my opinions to anyone's here, it would be the Dark Ages video by Overly Sarcastic Productions and History Matters. And I want to say this now, making this video sucked. I thought that with enough research and just gathering enough dates, I could formulate a script for a video without actually writing anything. And if it was something else, I bet I could, but not for history. So this video turned into a brutal slog, a meat grinder for yours truly. So if you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing because it would really mean a lot to me after everything I had to go through, and I promise the next video will be a lot sooner coming. Before we really discuss the validity of the term Dark Ages, we need to define what exactly they are, and where the term comes from. The origin of the term Dark Ages is generally accredited from having come out from under the stupid little head sock from one Petrarch, a Tuscan poet from the 14th century, which many of you will note is just about where and when the Renaissance would begin. And that division of the Renaissance and the Middle Ages is what is central to the idea of a Dark Ages. You see, Petrarch believed that the Renaissance was the enlightenment of Europe, where they finally began to drag themselves back into the light of learning and understanding, as opposed to the stagnant brutality of the Middle Ages which had preceded the Renaissance, and therefore making it a revival of the greater classical spirit. That is the core of the Dark Ages notion. Classical Rome good, Middle Ages bad, Renaissance good. But Petrarch doesn't really lay out a specific time period for what the Dark Ages are. And honestly, I think that's part of the problem as to why people disdain the term Dark Ages so much nowadays. Now, I'm not gonna say they're misunderstanding Petrarch, but what I will say is, for us to understand what the Dark Ages were, we need to really narrow our understanding, because that shaves off a lot of the arguments that people make against the term Dark Ages. You see, the Middle Ages lasted around 1,000 years, from the fall of Western Rome to the fall of Constantinople, give or take. That's a big oversimplification, but that's the general best accepted time frame. This is because after the fall of Constantinople in 1453, the Middle Ages end and give way to the early modern period, by which time the Renaissance in Italy had already begun. And herein we find our first sticking point. A lot of great things artistically, architecturally, culturally, and politically had already begun happening long before this time. All the oldest great stone castles in Western Europe started springing up around the year 1000. We had large states like the Holy Roman Empire, we had an influential papacy, we had a unified notion of France that would become especially prominent after the 100 Years' War. England got an early start on unification, we had the Norman conquests, we had the mounted knights that Europe is so famous for, and proper feudalism had sprung up around the 9th century. The 11th century would actually see the beginning of European stone castles being built, with many of the oldest still standing castles in France being French chateaux from around the year 1000, not to mention the absolutely mind-boggling amount of fortifications around Wales. And it wasn't all just stone and steel. The 9th and 10th centuries saw the creation of 2 incredibly medieval things: the fiddle and the Gregorian chant. Whenever you think Middle Ages and you hear a choir of monks singing in your head, yeah, that's a Gregorian chant you're almost certainly imagining. Not to mention the advancements in naval technology, such as the development of a ship type known as the cog, which really took off around the 1200s and saw higher walls to make boarding more difficult, as well as a larger carrying capacity. All of this in Western Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire and before the early modern period. And all of this is just Western Europe, because during most of the Middle Ages, the rest of the known world was doing pretty darn well for itself. This is another big complaint about the term Dark Ages. It's incredibly Eurocentric, because China under the Tang Dynasty was actually in its golden age. The Middle East was similarly in its golden age, with the Umayyad Caliphate creating great strides in learning and centralized authority. Western Africa was under the rule of the Ghana and later Mali empires, two of the richest kingdoms to ever exist in human history. And after the fall of the Roman Empire, Eastern Europe was actually doing quite well under the Roman Empire. Yeah, that's a big problem when it comes to talking about Europe after the fall of Rome, because Rome was still there for another 1,000 years. All the while, it served as a center of innovation, culture, learning, and a bastion of the classical knowledge and values that had been lost in the West. Hell, even places that don't get talked about at all during this time period were still undergoing very interesting eras of transformation. Eastern Europe, and specifically what would become the Empire of Russia, was beginning to take shape, with the Kievan Rus, Novgorod Republic, and Duchy of Moscow all coming into their own. East Africa south of Egypt, though fractured after the fall of the Aksumite Empire, was still doing pretty good and maintained good relationships with the Byzantine Empire. And my ancestral homeland of northern India, while fractured after the fall of the Gupta Empire, was again doing at least decently, though they did have to fend off a few invasions from the Huns. The great temple of Angkor Wat in what is now Cambodia was built around the 1100s, and what is now Indonesia saw a slew of great kingdoms, like the Kingdom of Kediri, Srivijaya, and the Empire of Majapahit. So how the hell does anyone go about calling this the Dark Ages? It seems like I've just spent the last 5 minutes shooting myself squarely in the foot. Well, here's where that distinct narrowing of the understanding of Dark Ages comes into play, because if you'll notice, basically everything I have listed thus far, especially in Western Europe, has all come about or developed in and around the years 900 to 1000. And just like that, the notion of what the real Dark Ages were becomes clear. It was in Western Europe during the period of ultimate decline and final fall of the Western Roman Empire, the mid-400s, up to around the year 800, a period of about 350 years. Many people nowadays get it wrong because they try and apply this term to the entire world and therefore find it void, or even all of Europe and the Near East. And they often take it to mean the entire Middle Ages, when in reality it's only referring to about the first third. And that's because during this time period, up until the year 800, Western Europe actually was a complete hole in the absence of Roman authority. Let's look at what makes civilizations great, what people use to indicate as not being in a dark age. Political centralization, that was not there, because all those territories Rome had once ruled suddenly descended into small, squabbling states that had to slowly, painstakingly be dragged together and congealed into something that resembled solid kingdoms. And the reason this process was so painstaking is because a lot of those groups of people practiced forms of tribal customs that made succession laws very loose, so they didn't go off straight primogeniture. And in the budding nation that would become France, the Kingdom of the Salian Franks led by Clovis I, the first French king, they practiced Salic law, which stipulated that all of the king's sons would be given a piece of their father's territory, meaning the process had to repeat every single time the king died. And these were the people who would unify Western Europe. And in the absence of Rome, much of the region would find itself in a similar position. What did this really entail, though? Why does this lack of central authority create a Dark Age? Well, it's because of a few reasons. This lack of central authority means a lack of large armies. In fact, you can see it when you find out that a lot of the battles of this age were really small affairs, at least when compared to what had been going on beforehand. There's a famous meme that goes, although outnumbered, the Romans mustered 50,000 infantry with 10,000 cavalry on the wings, and then underneath it says, the king launched his campaign with an army of approximately 46 men, including 13 knights, and his friend Godfrey. That's true. And in fact, a lot of people in this era who we would consider kings weren't really kings. They didn't really have subjects, they had followers, and in fact are often referred to as royal chieftains. But why is that a bad thing? The reason it's a bad thing is it meant that the Western Europeans at this time could not hold off foreign invaders. Italy under the Ostrogoths would be invaded by the Romans and find themselves conquered, at least for a time. And you have to understand, Italy had it the best out of all of Dark Age Europe by far, because they had so much to work with when it comes to Rome's leftovers. Furthermore, the former Roman province of Britannia, that being the Brittonic Celtish people who had been Romanized, known as the Romano-British, were overrun by the Anglo-Saxon invaders, coming out of South Denmark and northern Germany. Visigothic Spain was so politically unstable despite being a unified kingdom that the Umayyad Caliphate was literally able to just roll it up in 7 years. And furthermore, this lack of centralized authority meant that international trade basically dried up, where before you would have Roman coins showing up in China and even Japan, suddenly this place disappeared off the face of the wider earth. And this also meant a lack of construction of great monuments. In Spain, the Visigoths built very little, despite ruling until the early 700s. Now, I know they did build some good things like the Church of San Juan de Banos, but these things pale in comparison horrendously to what the Romans were building before and what would come after. Honestly, that's some of the biggest sourcing for this video, me just looking up as many monuments as I could built around that era, and just seeing what they looked like in comparison to what came after. And also making sure that they were in fact still standing, because a lot of the structures from that age just don't exist anymore. They'd either been demolished for larger projects, were destroyed by one means or another, or ended up burning down because they were made of wood. An example of this is actually the famous monastery at Lindisfarne, because the one that is currently there was rebuilt after the Norman conquests as a monastery, where before it was a wooden abbey. The famous English writer Bede actually did complain about this, because he believed instead of hewn oak, it should be made of stone. And a word about Lindisfarne while I'm at it. It actually serves as a really good microcosm for what was going on at the time. Yes, it was fairly unimpressive, but it actually did produce some of the knowledge and literacy coming out of Northern Europe at the time. You see, literacy rates had plummeted severely after the fall of the Roman Empire, as you can imagine, because now that there was less urban living, people just didn't really need to learn how to read as much. Granted, I'm not going to act like everybody knew how to read and write back during the Roman times, but it was certainly a much higher percentage. I say this by way of logic, by the way, as opposed to having significant concrete numbers, because it's just something we know to be a fact. Now, the thing about that is, after people deserted the cities, specialized trades began to die out en masse, so they didn't need to know how to read and write. Urban living is what spawned a written system to begin with all the way back in Mesopotamia. But it didn't die out entirely, and that is thanks to the church. Which is actually ironic because when a lot of people talk about the Dark Ages, they're often referring to cultures of fear and superstition, much of which they pin on the church. To the point where some people actually refer to this period as the quote-unquote Christian Dark Ages, as opposed to the Roman Pagan Age, and then the more atheistic Renaissance. All of which is wildly untrue and absolutely serves to hurt the legitimacy of the term Dark Ages, by the way. In fact, a lot of the texts that were kept safe in Western Europe at the time would be done so through the work of monks in their abbeys, making sure to transcribe them over and over again. And many of the great artworks of the age also come from these monks, who would make lavish covers for their holy books, and be basically the only group of people producing great works of literature at this time. And listen, even then, the great works of literature of this age come in the 700s and 800s, right at the tail end of the Dark Ages as I am outlining them. And it would be England that would take some of the lead on this, with the aforementioned Doctor of the Church Bede writing the Ecclesiastical History, and other works of English literature, such as a poem known as The Dream of the Rood, which is actually about the crucifixion from the perspective of Jesus' cross, and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. But that one was written after the year 800. And don't anyone start mentioning Beowulf, because even though that is one of the oldest surviving works of Old English literature, it's speculated to have been written around the 900s to the year 1000, well and truly after the Dark Ages were over. And you might have just noticed a pattern here. The two works that were written during the Dark Ages were the Ecclesiastical History and Dream of the Rood, both of which were pieces of Christian literature. And that's because the only people keeping literature alive were, again, the church. And the issue with that is the church's interests tend to be a bit limited, meaning that the only things they were talking about and writing about were ecclesiastical and theological topics, and as such, the humanities fell away completely. Much of what we understand as the great literature of antiquity, such as philosophy, biography, even commentary, all basically grind to a halt. So this whole era does come across looking like a hazy blur. So, after the fall of Rome, we were very much deprived of literature other than ecclesiastical ones. The notable architecture, all of which were churches, by the way, were usually nice, but were oftentimes just single-story affairs. Stone castles did not yet exist, and what they did have were something called motte and bailey forts. Certainly impressive to be sure, but not nearly the equal of, again, what was before and what came after. And this difference becomes exceptionally clear when you start talking about road construction, which broke down completely after Rome fell, with not even cities having paved roads, just well-worn footpaths. In fact, the only roads being used in Western Europe were the old Roman ones, which were steadily falling into disrepair as stones were pulled out of them to use in other construction projects. A problem that the Islamic world at the time actually didn't have, given that they had roads paved with literal tar in places like Baghdad. In fact, this gap between Western Europe and the rest of the world makes the term Dark Ages seem more fitting, because they really were lagging behind everyone else so much. In fact, it would take up until the 13th century for roads as we know them to really start coming into their own in Western Europe, with the advent of proper horse harnesses and swiveling carriage joints. Now, I actually have been talking a fair bit about previous Roman structures, and there was a place where they had more of those than anywhere else: Italy itself, and especially the city of Rome. So what was going on there? Well, for much of this time, Italy was an Ostrogothic kingdom under Theodoric the Great right after the fall of Rome. And again, I know the Byzantine Romans would pull up again, but they held on to it for like 5 seconds. And actually, even during the early Dark Ages, like the 500s, we do get some pretty good stuff coming out of Italy. An example of this being an important piece of literature called The Consolation of Philosophy, written by a writer named Boethius, who, while waiting for his execution, basically postulates on how evil and suffering can exist in a world run by God. And Theodoric himself would have his mausoleum built. The mausoleum of Theodoric is actually very impressive, even though it is, as I've previously said, modest compared to the other structures in Rome. It was an engineering feat, with the top dome being made from one giant piece of limestone. Even historians today are not sure how they managed to build and transport this thing, which does say a lot about it. Awesome. So, things in Italy were not as bad as the rest of Western Europe. Well, the problem with that is they had also been a lot better. Even though things hadn't gotten that bad in Italy, they had fallen so much farther considering the heights they had once resided in. In fact, I would go on to describe the city of Rome itself as damn near post-apocalyptic, with only a fraction of its population residing in the ruins of the once capital of the Western world, oftentimes grinding up the great statues that used to line the streets to make mortar for their cruder constructions, all while silt and soil from the flooding Tiber River would slowly bury the once great majesty of the past. That is so dismal and depressing, which actually brings me to another reason for why I consider this period of time to be the Dark Ages: the vibes. And I know that doesn't sound very intellectual, I know it doesn't sound official, but in my mind, vibes are a legitimate way to measure and understand things. It's our gut reaction to what we see before us on the page. Because even though great things were still happening, monuments and literature still being produced in smaller quantities, it just feels so dismal. And the existence of a few rare examples doesn't delegitimize that feeling of a Dark Age. In fact, this is something that Petrarch himself comments on, bringing this all the way back to him. In 1367, Petrarch would say, "Amidst the errors there shone forth men of genius, no less keen were their eyes, although they were surrounded by darkness and dense gloom." He's not saying that things weren't happening at all, it's just that the current environment anyone brilliant found themselves in did not lend itself to great construction or promoting their intelligence. And it isn't really due to, as far as we can tell, active suppression, but more so just a lack of opportunity to do so. No one has the time to argue rhetoric when you're trying to not starve to death. And since the only source of knowledge, i.e. the only people with enough funds granted to them to have the free time to pursue these sorts of things, was the church, the humanities dwindled and withered. But to really understand why Petrarch viewed the Dark Ages as such and where he's generally coming from, we need to get a bit of a backstory on the man himself. You see, Petrarch to me is honestly the first emo teenager in human history. Because he, to make things brief, started out studying law because that's what his father wanted, but Petrarch viewed this as intellectually selling out, because he wanted to be a writer and a poet, and according to some sources, Petrarch's father, absolutely fed up with him, threw his philosophy books into the street and set them on fire. So in response to this, Petrarch would abandon law and actually start working for a cardinal, which allowed him to write more freely, as well as travel. And this actually makes him, by some people's estimation, the first tourist, because he would travel not for study, but for pleasure. And one of these trips would take him to the chapter library in Verona, where he would discover the letters of none other than Cicero, the great Roman lawyer and statesman. And so awed by these letters was Petrarch that he would set about translating every single one of them, and the translation of these lost letters in 1345 is actually considered to be one of the impetuses for the Renaissance, because it brought humanism back into the fold. It really helped bring the light of antiquity back into the European consciousness, and showed just how quote-unquote brilliant these people were when compared to the quote-unquote barbarians of the medieval age who came after. Now, I have to state, there are a lot of other reasons for the Renaissance, and funnily enough, History Matters, who I mentioned earlier, and who served as one of the inspirations for this video, has a whole video himself about why the Renaissance started in Italy, and lists a few reasons for why that is. But one of the reasons it got its very earliest starts was here, with Petrarch's finding of these letters. But knowing Petrarch's backstory honestly really reframes this, because he stumbled across these letters that just really spoke to him, because nobody in the medieval age or his dad just got him, you know? They didn't get it. See, this is what I mean when I call Petrarch the first emo teenager. He's literally like a 13-year-old kid discovering MCR for the first time. And with all of this in mind, it becomes a little more understandable why he was willing to just tar the entire Middle Ages with the brush of Dark Ages. But I hope over the course of my video, I have helped refocus that and really helped make it clear that while Petrarch wasn't wrong in using the term Dark Ages at all, he wasn't really fully on the money. However, the term does still have validity in highlighting just how much Western Europe had declined without Rome. Even the cities which nominally did okay, like Lyon in France, still suffered a lot. And a funny thing about Lyon, it did actually maintain its status as at least a semi-important urban center in Western Europe after Rome fell, but that was because of the presence of a lot of ecclesiastical groups. Again, the church stepping in and keeping some institutions alive. So, once again, to recap, Western Europeans could not repel foreign invaders, they could not produce great literary works at the time, they could not field large armies, they could not engage in large-scale amounts of international trade, and they could not engage in large public works or build impressive large pieces of architecture. Any of these things that did persist were usually smaller versions of what had existed in Rome and were the purview of the church. But, as I have stated, the Dark Ages didn't last. I said earlier they ended around the year 800. So what changed? What ushered in almost 600 years of post-Dark Age medieval Europe? The answer is Charlemagne. Now, for those who don't know, ever since Clovis in the 500s, France, or what would later become France, had been steadily getting bigger and bigger, all the way up until eventually Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, or Carolus Magnus, would become the new emperor of the Frankish kingdom. And he ruled a mighty nation, encompassing much of what is now France, the Low Countries, and most of West Germany, creating what is now effectively the groundwork for what we consider Western Europe today. And the reason he was such a big deal is because not only would he be crowned Holy Roman Emperor, but he sort of started to establish the precedent for what we would assume to be a medieval monarch properly, as opposed to his predecessors such as Pepin the Short and Charles Martel. Yes, as in the Charles Martel from the Battle of Tours. By being crowned Holy Roman Emperor, he provided a lot of legitimacy to his rule and started that close relationship between monarchs and the papacy. And he ushered in something known as the Carolingian Renaissance, the Carolingians being the dynasty he hailed from. Now, the Carolingian Renaissance saw a revitalization of learning across the territories he ruled, which were, as previously stated, massive. A big part of the reason for this was because since the country he ruled was so huge, he needed good administration to help him run it, and to manage all the people who ran the various areas of his kingdom for him, an arrangement that would come to form the basis for what would be known as feudalism. So, he sponsored a large campaign of learning and opened several palatial schools so that administrators and his nobles could be well educated, steadily starting to bring literacy back into Western Europe, specifically the reintroduction of the Latin language, and this helped various classics and other Roman documents start to be introduced back into the minds of Western Europeans, where before, Latin and literacy had largely been the purview of just the church. A big part of how he did this was by gathering up as many learned European scholars as he could find, and gathering them all at his favored residence in Aachen, chief among them being an English cleric by the name of Alcuin, who would eventually go on to become the Abbot of Tours. Also, funnily enough, Charlemagne himself would undergo a lot of this education, so I just find that mental image to be really funny, like Charlemagne just sitting in the classroom with everyone else wearing like a little backpack and having a little sandwich or something. And interestingly, he wasn't even that good at it, because according to Einhard, Charlemagne didn't know how to write, and some people aren't even sure if he could read or not. The consensus does seem to be that he could read Latin and at least a little bit of Greek. The fact that it's still up for debate is mind-boggling, because this man's father, Pepin, was an incredibly powerful king by the standards of the time, and the fact that his son was not educated really lends a lot of credence to the notion of this being the Dark Ages, and the fact that Charlemagne ended said Dark Ages with his promotion of education and literacy. And I know it's gonna sound a little mean, but I just find it a little funny, because regarding his attempts at writing, Einhard, his biographer and arguably best friend, openly states, as he did not begin his efforts in due season, but late in life, they met with ill success. Just imagine being the guy who has to teach the Emperor of the Romans how to write his ABCs, and moreover, being the guy to tell him that he just got it wrong. It's honestly a little bit ironic, considering the Carolingian Renaissance saw the introduction of Carolingian minuscule, that being the invention of lowercase letters. But please keep in mind that this man's predecessor in the eyes of many at the time was Marcus Aurelius, the Platonic ideal of the philosopher king who wrote the Meditations. Meanwhile, Charlemagne's biggest contribution to the written word was his signature, which, mind you, looked like this! But no Dark Ages here, everything's fine. But it actually is important, all jokes aside, because he wasn't just some warlord like others who had come before him. He was someone who deeply valued learning beyond what it could just do for him. And a big part of this actually was his religious beliefs, because he believed you couldn't be a good Christian until you knew what a good Christian was. One of the more famous pieces of writing from his reign, not written by him obviously, but rather dictated, is actually him complaining to an abbot about the fact that not enough of his monks and clergy knew how to read, and as such could be making errors in how they interpret scripture and present the Bible. And in doing so, his sponsoring of learning across his realm would see a uniformity of Christendom in that part of Europe, where everything would become more uniformly Catholic, and we would start to see the erasure of other schismatic doctrines, such as the more Germanic Arian Christianity. This right here shows in microcosm why this large centralized state that he ruled was so important in beating back the Dark Ages, because people would study and teach in Aachen and then spread out to the rest of the realm freely, thereby expanding the scope of knowledge and carrying the lessons and mentalities of learning with them. And an interesting thing about Aachen is that is where Charlemagne's cathedral is built, an absolutely breathtaking monument. And it was built from 793 to 813, one of the very first of its kind. And even though more would be added to it later down the line, and some parts would be refurbished around the year 1000 and a bit onwards, the groundwork was laid by Charlemagne and his architects. And this thing makes everything up until that point in Europe look like garbage outside of maybe Rome itself. Remember, this was before any of the stone castles were being built in Europe. And this was only when the best things Europe had to offer was Theodoric's mausoleum at best. You remember those Visigothic churches I had been showing earlier? Compare those to this, and tell me those are not just like piss by comparison. And again, the reason he could do these things was because he could gather people around himself who were very learned from all corners of Western Europe and even Eastern Europe. And he didn't have to worry as much about being invaded and having these structures burnt or sacked, or having his learned men slaughtered, because he created this strong centralized realm. And as previously stated, there would be a cultural revival under him, not just in the attitudes towards learning, but also the aforementioned introduction of the Gregorian chant, and a writing boom, because after he died, his chief biographer Einhard would write the Vita Carolingiani, or The Life of Charlemagne. Completed sometime in the 830s, it was an incredibly important piece of literature, and that's because it saw the revival of biography in Western Europe, following in the traditions of Roman scholars like Suetonius and especially Plutarch, someone I am a big fan of. And similar to their works, the Vita Carolingiani is not just blind praise of Charlemagne all the way through, just mostly. There are points where he does talk about Charlemagne's failings, a lot of that coming from his struggles with his family life. And that is so huge, we get this glimpse into his personal life, someone who was declared the Emperor of the Romans in the year 800. These were things that were just not done in the previous centuries. The reason this is such a big deal is because, as previously mentioned, all the writing going on during the pre-800 Dark Ages was related to the church, because they had a monopoly on basically all of literacy at that time. But the Vita Carolingiani is largely secular. Sure, aspects of faith are mentioned here and there, but it is a biography, not a work of theology, but a humanity. And it would go on to inspire other works later down the line that would follow in this style. And interestingly, the whole text is available free on YouTube by the channel Study of Antiquity and the Middle Ages, narrated very well. And I have to say, it is such a great text. It is beautifully written, dripping with personality. Einhard is a great writer and a very good narrator, and he is just a treat to listen to. So, if you get the chance, it's about an hour and 20 minutes, go and give it a listen, even if you have to listen on double speed, because it is a damn shame that this is not more widely known as one of the preeminent texts of the entire Middle Ages. But, in the Vita Carolingiani, we see something very telling about the nature of the Dark Ages. Even the men of that time, when the Dark Ages were coming to a close by my estimation in the 800s, even then knew they were not the equal of those who had come before them. Einhard himself even says as much, stating that, "The chronicle of such a king is so grand, the fact that it is left to my paltry and insignificant gifts is a tremendous shame. I have no words to describe my life with the emperor. He needs more than my ill-formed words. He needs the eloquence of a Cicero." God, why does everything come back to Cicero? Now, I know it will just seem like generic humbleness, but it really does say to me that people back then were aware of the fact that they were not advancing forward from where Western Europe had previously been. They were clawing their way back to that level. And this is illustrated with Charlemagne's taking of the title of Emperor of the Romans, because his conquests were not viewed as something new and grand. People viewed it as a Rome restored, a return to what had been lost, not something new on its own merits, such as with the birth of France or England, but instead a restoration. And as previously mentioned, on the other side of things, we get the first written copy of Beowulf, and we get the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and all sorts of things in this era. And the reason things were actually going quite well in England, despite not being in Charlemagne's realm, was because they were also undergoing their own period of centralization right around this time. Specifically, out of the 4 great Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, one of them would rise to prominence and really start making great things happen. That being Mercia. Much of this time period is actually referred to as the Mercian supremacy, where out of Northumbria, East Anglia, Wessex, and Mercia, they would have the largest sway on the Isles. Even though it wasn't a formal expansion of territory, they would still claim the other kingdoms as vassals. And, just given their location, they had to deal with less external conflict and could start consolidating their resources. This would give them the ability to start building large things such as Offa's dikes, where King Offa of Mercia would effectively have constructed a giant ditch and hill all the way across the border between England and Wales, from North Sea to South Sea. And while it wasn't a great stone structure or a series of castles, it was still an enormous feat of engineering for the time, and shows the ability to command large-scale resources and many workers to make something like this happen. However, it should be noted that the Mercian supremacy did not last, and their rule over what would become England would be supplanted by Wessex, especially under King Alfred the Great. So Mercia would start dragging Britain out of the Dark Ages, Wessex would finish the process, and it would be the Normans who would conquer England in 1066, who really cemented it, bringing things such as castle construction and much of the other lessons learned from Charlemagne and his successors to Britain. Now, I would like to address something, and it's the fact that I've been referring to the end of the Dark Ages in England through the eyes of the Anglo-Saxons. But the Anglo-Saxons were not the indigenous population of the British Isles. That was the Brittonic Celts, and to a degree the Romano-British. Okay, so big whoop. But you see, the issue is that I have been referring to the Anglo-Saxons as the ones who took them out of the Dark Age, even though I am not extending that same consideration to the Umayyads in Spain. Even though that Umayyad Iberia, or Al-Andalus as it was known at the time, was by a wide margin the best place to be in Western Europe during this time period, after they had conquered the peninsula in 711. They had centralization, strong military presences, breathtaking architecture, and a very good academic and administrative culture. In fact, people use the existence of Al-Andalus as a reason for why the Dark Ages didn't happen, because things were going pretty well. But I actually don't count it because the Umayyads were both not Iberian and would be driven out of Iberia later down the line. And the reason they're different from the Anglo-Saxons is because the Anglo-Saxons made that transition from occupying force to predominant settled population, where they would become the majority ethnic group, intermix with those Brittonic Celts who were not pushed into Wales and Cornwall, and would leave a lasting legacy ethnically, linguistically, and culturally. Whereas Al-Andalus would not leave such a legacy because they would not have the time to make that transition. They stayed a minority occupying force in Iberia. If they had, say, come there in greater numbers and mixed with the indigenous population more ethnically, Islam had a lasting presence in the region, and if Arabic or a form of hybridized Arabic-Iberian dialect had remained the lingua franca of the region, as opposed to being supplanted by Spanish and Portuguese, then I actually would be comfortable saying that the Umayyads had brought Spain out of the Dark Ages before the rest of Western Europe, thereby giving them a head start of at least 100 years. But as we know, this would not come to pass because of the Reconquista. And as such, the path for Spain, that being the indigenous Iberians, out of the Dark Ages, was a different one from the rest of Western Europe. Theirs was a much more military process instead of a cultural one, pushing back against the Umayyads and eventually driving them out of the peninsula over the course of centuries, something that had really begun in full tilt by around, guess what, the year 800, with the Kingdom of Asturias and then eventually Leon and Castile carving out their spheres of influence in the north of Iberia and then pushing them back down to the coast, finally completing the Reconquista in the mid-1400s, right around the time the Middle Ages are generally accepted to have ended in Europe, with the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Empire. And as they pushed forward against the Arabs, they were able to take advantage of the culture and knowledge brought by the Arabs into the peninsula, something that the Visigoths before the Umayyads had only been clinging onto by their fingertips. Now, I know I've been hard on the Visigoths, making fun of their churches and whatnot, but I guess they weren't the worst in the world, but it should be noted they had more to work with than the rest of Europe, because Iberia had been settled by the Romans a long time before the rest of Western Europe, and as such it was much more urbanized. They had a lot of really great resources that the Romans were very eager to keep, and the warfare that took place in the region even up until the end of Western Rome was nowhere near as destructive as it was in, say, France and Italy. I would still, though, put them behind the Italians in terms of quality of life in regard to what they had inherited, that being the Ostrogoths in Italy, but still, it's a dark age because they were not advancing much and were only trying to maintain what they had. They had just been given a little more than the other regions. That was a key feature of Visigothic rule in Spain, this desperate attempt to keep both the classics alive and the architecture intact, two things that they were only able to partly do. And one figure that really stands out in regard to this is one Isidore of Seville, a bishop who really took a leading role in preserving the literary and intellectual heritage of the Greco-Roman world in Spain. This is best exemplified in his writing the Etymologiae in 625. Basically, the Etymologiae is a compilation of summaries of various texts and sources from the classical world that still survived in Spain and could be summarized to form effectively a 20-book encyclopedia. However, it should be noted that Isidore did not have an insanely large selection to choose from, because according to the video by Thucydides the historian about Visigothic Spain, Isidore's library was only about 600 or 700 books, which isn't that much compared to the fact that other places in Europe at this time had libraries numbering in the thousands. But the Etymologiae is still a very important book, and even Dante Alighieri was a fan of it over 600 years later. Interestingly, that is why Isidore is one of the people that Dante writes into heaven in his Paradiso. And even more interestingly, Pope John Paul II apparently declared Isidore of Seville to be the patron saint of the internet. I'm not kidding, you can look that up. But even though much of Isidore's work was not inherently ecclesiastical, I think he does fall into a similar situation as Bede with his ecclesiastical histories, because he was a singular figure, where before men of his caliber likely would have flourished in spades in Rome and Greece. But he was largely alone. And this is something, as previously stated, Petrarch does mention, stating that great men with great minds were born, but the world around them just sucked. Another example of this phenomena comes to us in Gaul, in the form of a bishop by the name of Gregory of Tours, who was born from sometime around 538 AD and lived until around 594, meaning he was largely his most active right about 100 years after Western Rome had fallen. And the interesting thing about him is that even though he served in the courts of the earliest Frankish Merovingian kings, the descendants of Clovis I, he was not a Frank. In fact, he is identified as something called Gallo-Roman, in the same way the people in the British Isles could be identified as either Celts or the Romano-Britons. And interestingly, he is known as the, quote, father of French history, and it's actually from him where our only perceptions of the Merovingians come from in their earliest stages, aside from Einhard, who would recount the very end of the Merovingian dynasty. And again, he serves as a good example of a brilliant man living in a dismal time, as Petrarch did outline, because he writes extensively about the cruelty of the early Merovingian lords and only really praises them whenever they're doing something vaguely Catholic. In fact, much of what he writes about is nowadays called into question, or at least taken with a grain of salt, because it seems like he had a heavy bias against the Merovingian rulers and was very in favor of members of the clergy at the time. And the reason for that is because those people who took their power from the clergy were often Gallo-Romans, because they were the most educated ones who slotted into that role, as their natural base of power evaporated. This is because the last Gallo-Roman kingdom would be toppled by Clovis himself in the year 486 at the Battle of Soissons. And while the Gallo-Romans, at least their elites anyway, would keep some of those literary and intellectual traditions alive, they would largely have to assimilate to the new Frankish way of thinking and serve as the few learned men in their courts. This is again where we get men like Gregory of Tours in Tours, and the city of Lyon that I mentioned earlier. These were some of the hubs of Gallo-Romans who were involved in the church, who could keep these urban centers at least functioning and semi-relevant. This is a big part of why the clergy had the power they had and were able to keep the literary traditions alive. They were carrying on the traditions of the Romans, which lived on through those people who had accepted their way of life most ardently. And over time, their influence would erode over the centuries as the Dark Ages marched on, and they would be eventually supplanted. The connection these people had to the church in Rome must be acknowledged as a very important factor in spreading Catholicism and literacy. And I don't think that diminishes the understanding of this as a Dark Age, it just highlights the ability of Roman culture to survive and persist. If anything, it highlights how great Roman culture was compared to what came after. I know that's a little biased of me to say and a little harsh, but you have to understand where I'm coming from when I make that assessment. These are things that did not die, kind of like how a lot of the gods that later Greeks would worship in the Hellenistic period were actually Mycenaean ones that refused to disappear completely and had to evolve over time. That is why we see these Roman administrative and military terms evolving into ecclesiastical ones, because the Romans' cultural descendants in places like Gaul turned to the clergy as a way to maintain relevance and power. But as previously stated, this would erode over time, to the point where Charlemagne was literally concerned about the amounts of illiteracy within the priesthood and had to personally do something about it. And in my opinion, it's a little bit sad when the literal illiterate is literally telling you to crack open a book for once. Also, furthermore, Gregory's 10 Histories is again a very ecclesiastical text, even if it's not directly dealing with the church, such as Bede's Ecclesiastical History, because he talks about miracles and things like that, and the first part of it is literally dedicated to recounting the Old and New Testaments, something Einhard, almost 250 years later, would not do. In fact, the Vita Carolingiani is just much better written than the Histories, because while there is more going on in the Histories because it covers a much wider breadth of time and is a little more sensationalized with things like miracles and other such things occurring in it, the Vita Carolingiani is a wonderful piece of Roman-style classical literature, with excellent prose and formatting. One feels like a genuine piece of literature, while the other is honestly just Gregory rambling. And part of this is because Gregory was one of the last vestiges of the dying late antiquity, where he was trying to keep the Roman literary tradition alive, while Einhard was the product of its revival. Another important thing to note about Einhard is that he was a Frank, while Gregory of Tours was not. And that's the thing about these men I've been talking about, like Isidore and Gregory. Isidore of Seville was in Spain, but he was a Hispano-Roman. He was not a Visigoth. Gregory was not a Frank, and Boethius was not an Ostrogoth. He was a Roman. Now, I've been working on this video for quite some time, and it's definitely gotten out of hand and gotten away from me in places, so I can't even remember if I've talked about Boethius, so I'm gonna do that now and just pray to God I haven't already. If I have, I'll just cut this out in editing. Simply put, Boethius was a Roman senator, because the Roman Senate was still meeting in the city of Rome, even though they weren't doing much of anything, who served in the court of Theodoric the Great, the Ostrogothic king of Italy at the time, but would eventually be sentenced to death for treason after what many agreed to have been a very hasty and honestly almost illegal court proceeding. But before his execution, he would write on the Consolation of Philosophy, something that is considered by History Matters to be one of the most important medieval texts ever written. To make a long horse short, On the Consolation of Philosophy is essentially a Stoic text, not too dissimilar from the Meditations, made all the more interesting when you know the context around it. But again, we have to go back to Petrarch. Great men like Boethius were being born and doing their thing at the time, but the world around them was a dismal place, especially for Boethius, considering the fact that he was, literally on death row, waiting to die when he wrote this. And it bears worth mentioning that Isidore of Seville, Gregory of Tours, and Boethius were all active in and around similar time periods, usually around the mid-500s, even though Isidore of Seville would have his Etymologiae published in around 625. It becomes clear when you consider who these men were, Hispano-Roman, Gallo-Roman, and a senator, and the time frame in which they were active, that they were not part of the early Middle Ages, Dark Ages, but were rather some of the last fibers of late antiquity still holding on. Also, since I mentioned the fact that Boethius was a senator, the Roman Senate was still doing things and even did have a little bit of influence, especially under more Roman-minded Germanic kings like Theodoric the Great, who ironically is the one who killed Boethius. It would steadily keep fading from the historical records in regard to any proclamations or any kind of notable goings-on until around the year 630, when the Pope would have the Curia converted into a church. So the Roman Senate, an institution generally believed to have been founded in 753 BC, an institution that survived civil wars, empires, crises, plagues, schisms, sackings, and anything else you could reasonably throw at anything in the world, died on an unknown day, on an unremarkable year, with no one around to even record the opinions of the men at the time. And this notion of great individuals coming to power and prominence in this time period, but the rest of the world around them not being able to back it up, isn't just isolated to thinkers and writers like Isidore and Gregory and Boethius, but also extends to rulers, not least of all among them being Theodoric the Great. Now, up until this point, much of my discussion regarding Theodoric has been surrounding his mausoleum and also his killing of Boethius. But it's a lot more complicated because he's less of a figure from the Dark Ages and more a figure of late antiquity, because he's generally considered to have been one of the greatest leaders of Italy in a very long time, and that does include a lot of the late Roman emperors. He was the king of Italy from 493 to 526, and during that time, he embarked on various building projects across Italy, and saw a very stable period of rule, at least by the standards of the time, even though obviously he commanded less resources because his personal kingdom only really stretched from the Italian peninsula and to part of the Balkans. But this would change because over time he would be able to exert nominal control and heavy influence in the other Gothic states in the region, that being Vandal-held North Africa and Visigothic Spain. This was because after the king of the Visigoths would be killed by Clovis I, yeah, just a heads up, Theodoric and Clovis hated each other with a burning passion. Theodoric, who had been the Visigothic king Alaric II's father-in-law, became the regent of Visigothic Spain, and while he never had any formal political control over Vandal North Africa, they were absolutely answering to him as their suzerain. So in that 30-year period where Theodoric conducted himself as effectively a Western Roman emperor in all but name, he was able to create an informal Gothic empire that almost entirely surrounded the Western Mediterranean Ocean. All the while, he maintained excellent relations with the Byzantines in the East, because he had actually grown up as a captive in the Byzantine court and was enamored with their way of life and of doing things. Apparently, he is quoted to have having commented on multiple occasions, "An able Goth wants to be like a Roman. Only a poor Roman would want to be like a Goth." And even though he didn't declare himself emperor or wear the imperial regalia, he did wear robes dyed purple, all the while maintaining the delicate balancing act between the new Goths in the region and the old Romans, allowing Romans to live under Roman law and Goths to live under Gothic law. However, this was not to last, because eventually the Dark Ages would reach Theodoric's kingdom. This was because relationships with the Byzantine Romans that he admired so much would begin to sour, in no small part because Clovis would depict himself as being the champion of the Western Nicene Church while casting Theodoric as a heretical Arian Christian. And the informal empire he had worked so hard to build would come apart at the seams even before he died, with the loyal Vandal king being overthrown by a man named Gelimer. And after Theodoric died, Visigothic Spain would once again reassert its independence away from Ostrogothic Italy. A big part of this was because Theodoric would be succeeded by his grandson who was too young to rule and whose mother would serve as regent. She tried to raise her son to be like a Roman, like his grandfather, but it wasn't to last because he would die young and then she would be drowned in her bath, at which point Italy would be invaded by the Byzantines, who would basically war all across the peninsula up until 553, when the last Ostrogothic ruler was overthrown, and then in would eventually come the Lombards. Honestly, had Theodoric born in other times, we would probably view him as the equal to someone like Aurelian. In fact, the historian John Julius Norwich would write of him, "No other Germanic ruler setting up his throne on the ruins of the Western Empire possessed a fraction of the statesmanship and political vision, and when he died, Italy lost to the greatest of their early medieval rulers, unequaled until the days of Charlemagne." Theodoric was a singular figure, and despite his enormous accomplishments that absolutely earned him the title of the Great, the world around him just wasn't ready for him. This was one of the features of the Dark Ages, because while states were slowly being reassembled, men like Theodoric, who had the desire and even the power to undertake great works and really get things going, lacked the momentum and the will of those around them. Hell, even the building of the Carolingian Empire that Charlemagne ruled over would take a lot longer than it should have, because every time the current ruler died, power would be split between his sons, something that would also go on to doom Charlemagne's empire once he and his son were out of the picture. And notice I'm saying ruler and not king. That's because for a long time, the person in charge of the Frankish Empire wasn't the king, but was rather someone called the quote-unquote mayor of the palace. And the reason for this is because the later Merovingians would become incredibly shiftless and lazy, and as such, just live lives of what passed for leisure in that time and place, while the mayor of the palace held all the real power and had to do the actual governing. It's actually stated by Einhard in the Vita Carolingiani that they would just wheel out the Merovingian king on a horse cart in front of people once a year, where he would listen to their problems, nod and pretend to think, and then just be stuffed back into a closet where they could be ignored. In fact, Charles Martel was never actually king. He was the mayor. However, when the king he served under, quote-unquote, died, he would just see fit to not appoint a new king because why even bother? But he still didn't take the title for himself. It would eventually be his son Pippin who would become the sole king of the Franks after the brother he ruled with, Carloman, would renounce his authority and become a monk. Pippin would just boot out the current king and say, "Screw it, I'm in charge now," beginning the Carolingian dynasty, which he named after his father Charles. Compare these later Merovingian kings to the hyper-dynamic and effective rulers that came after and before, and this age is starting to look a little dark. Okay, I'm officially adding in a little post-edit here because I had just realized this whole video was about 1 hour and 10 minutes long, so I thought, I might as well just try and slide in at least 5 more minutes, because if I do that, then it does technically qualify for the definition of a feature-length documentary. At this point, honestly, I'd say I've earned that. So let's go back to England in the 500s and talk about a man named Gildas. Now, Gildas, or Saint Gildas as he would come to be known, was actually not a Briton. In fact, he was born in Scotland, right within striking distance of what is now Glasgow. Now, it should be noted there are many different versions of his origin, but all of them do agree on the fact that he was allegedly the son of a king and gave up his royal heritage and titles to become a monk. He would also later in life head to Bretagne in France and establish a famous monastery there, Bretagne being the region of France on its western coast that maintains the strongest sense of Celtic identity. Think of it like the Wales of France. And what he did was write extensively about English history prior to the Anglo-Saxon invasions. His seminal work is a piece called De Excidio et Conquiste Britanniae. I almost certainly pronounced that wrong. Which is about the history of Roman Britain all the way up until its abandonment by the Romans, and history up until the Battle of Mons Badonicus, which effectively was the biggest victory, according to legend, of the Brittonic Celts against the invading Anglo-Saxons, but that only halted their expansion temporarily, as you can imagine. Specifically though, and this is very interesting, he credits this victory to a military commander named Ambrosius Aurelianus, whose parents are said to, by Gildas, have worn the purple, meaning they were either senators or military leaders. The way Gildas describes Aurelianus is basically to portray him as the last true Roman in Britannia at this time, depicting him as the ideal form of both Christian and civilized man that the Britons of his age should be striving to be like, but are failing to do so, because the entire rest of the piece is a vicious condemnation of the people, the clergy, and especially the kings at the time who were still in power after the halting of the Anglo-Saxon invasions. Basically, he's claiming that the reason for the Anglo-Saxon invasions is because the clergy and kings had all become lax in their moral duties, and as such were being visited upon by the wrath of God. So even though Gildas's work is considered the preeminent history about post-Roman pre-Anglo-Saxon Britain, it's not actually meant as a proper history, but is in fact something called a polemic, which is an old form of writing that was designed to attack certain ideas, people, and mentalities existing at a certain time, and argue against them. This makes a polemic a form of rhetoric, and as you can imagine, they were very popular in ancient Rome and Greece. But as time went on, they largely began to fall out of use in Western Europe. And I really looked for any notable polemics around this time, but sometimes in history, a source is not what you find, but rather what you can't find. Because it really does seem like nobody was writing pure polemics at this time, even if some writings did have elements of them. And it makes sense why Gildas would write a polemic, considering his entire brand was "everything sucks nowadays and everything was better before I was born," because he claims to have been born the same year as the Battle of Mons Badonicus. Also, interestingly, in much later texts, the Battle of Mons Badonicus would actually be credited to King Arthur. So a lot of people believe the character of Ambrosius Aurelianus, whether or not he existed or not, is the basis for King Arthur. Even though, ironically, Aurelianus does appear in some of the Arthurian mythos as sometimes an uncle to Arthur himself. But the way Gildas talks about his contemporaries makes it clear that he does fit in to the Petrarchian concept of a bright man in a dark age. And I'm gonna go ahead and coin the term Petrarchian here to describe that concept, as opposed to Petrarchan, which is actually a kind of sonnet that he used. Also, let me talk a little bit about polemics since I mentioned them. As previously stated, the polemic is a form of writing very popular in the classical age, especially with the ancient Greeks, including Polybius, who was really big on them. But, as you can imagine, the writing of polemics decreased massively in the Dark Ages because of the drop in literacy. But that wasn't the only reason, and this highlights another issue with the Dark Ages: the lack of diversity of thought. And that's because there were less polemics because everyone agreed on everything. Church good, Pope good, pagans bad, king good, Arian Christendom bad, you know, and so on. And part of the reason was because if you criticized any of these people, you might not end up living very long. And again, most people just were not that literate aside from members of the church. And as you can imagine, they would only be writing about ecclesiastical topics, so there was no need for a polemic. They're not just going to go ahead and challenge themselves. This is why we see the resurgence of the polemic begin to occur around the 1300s, right before the fall of Rome and the Renaissance. One such early polemicist being Dante Alighieri, and also John Wycliffe, who tried to translate the Bible into English and got in a lot of trouble for it. And furthermore, there were polemics showing up even earlier than that, around the 1100s, but these were mostly made by Jews directed towards other Jews, arguing against conversion to other religions like Christianity or Islam. What I'm saying here is, the Dark Ages saw a lack of diversity of thought that would come into vogue later. Alright, this video is getting long and I'm starting to get heartburn, so let me touch on Italy a little bit before wrapping things up. I know I have been talking about Ostrogothic Italy and Theodoric the Great and his mausoleum and other such things, but the Ostrogoths didn't stay in charge of Italy. They were allies of Rome and did hold it for a time, but they would eventually be supplanted by the Lombards. You see, this is part of Italy's Dark Ages. First the Ostrogoths, then the Eastern Romans, then the Lombards, then the Franks, where in previous centuries, the Italian peninsula was seen as nigh on impregnable. It was now being run over by basically anyone with a few friends and a weekend to kill. The Lombards, for their part, would rule over Italy from about 568 to around 774. After that, the Franks would turn up and conquer most of the north, leading to, of course, Charlemagne being crowned Emperor of the Romans in the year 800 by the Pope. So, during that 200-year period of Lombard rule, what was Italy like? Well, for one, not unified, because even after the Byzantines had been kicked out, they still held on to certain important parts of the peninsula, one of these being the city of Rome itself. which was not very profitable, but still very important. They would actually hold on to it until 756, until the establishment of the Papal States, something that was actually done by Charlemagne's father, Pepin the Short. And Venice. That stayed in Byzantine hands. However, again, in the late 700s, they were more or less acting independently from the Byzantine Empire. This would become largely ratified in 840, with the signing of a document called the Pactum Lothari, which largely declared Venice to be independent from the Byzantines under the Doge, and several parts of the Italian mainland were nominally independent, especially in the east and south, specifically Spoleto and Beneventum, both of which, while nominally Lombard duchies allied to the Lombard King of Italy, maintained a lot of regional independence and continually allied with other outside powers whenever there was an internal or external dispute. So they did cause a lot of strife within Lombard Italy, and Beneventum was so independent, they were literally making their own damn coinage. And even before the Lombards would be conquered outright by the Franks, their territory was being steadily chipped away, including losing the city of Ravenna to the Papal States. Honestly, the whole 200-year history of Lombard Italy is them just trying to stave off outside invasions and subjugate Spoleto and Beneventum. Operative word being trying. Sicily, though, is honestly a weird one because things were going really well there, because even though it was conquered by the Vandals very early on who held control of North Africa, it would be taken back by the Byzantines in the 500s fairly early on, and they would hang on to it up through to 827, at which point the Muslims would begin to conquer Sicily, which they would finish in around 902, after which the Dark Ages had by then since mostly passed. So I'm actually not really counting Sicily in this definition of Dark Ages because it was under Byzantine control for most of that time, and thusly they had greater access to certain resources and scholarship that other regions didn't have. So that's most of the region covered, but I've very notably not been talking about Germany in any capacity, and there is a reason for that. The Roman presence in Germania was much more minimal compared to Gaul and happened a fair bit later, and as such, most of what was there was just garrison towns and things like that, as opposed to very established cultural centers. And that was just a sliver of Western Germany. In reality, most of what we now know as Germany, and most of what would become Germany as they knew it in the Holy Roman Empire, was never even touched by Rome outside of raiding and warring. So, it doesn't really count because they didn't have a Dark Age, because there was nowhere for them to really fall from. What they had was just a slow upward progression over time. There was no break in that chain of development that needed to be corrected, as there had been in France, and England, and Spain, and Portugal, and Italy. And that is a big part of what makes this all so poignant, because the first four of those that I just mentioned would go on to swallow the planet. This really does cut to the heart of why I do vouch for the term Dark Ages within these specific parameters. It's not to denigrate the people who lived through those very difficult times and often did try their best. It's to illustrate both what was lost when Rome fell away, and even more so, to really pay tribute to the enormous effort of men like Charlemagne and Alfred the Great and Offa, because of what they were able to bring back, how they were able to lift up so much of the world that had basically sunk into the mud. So if the Dark Ages ended in the year 800 with Charlemagne being crowned Holy Roman Emperor, what happened next? Well, Charlemagne would eventually die, and when he did, things would not keep going forward with the same momentum, because even though Charlemagne only had one surviving son, and as such his empire passed intact into the hands of Louis the Pious very easily, Carolingian law stipulated that a ruler's possessions would be divided amongst his sons, who would each get their own kingdom to rule. So since Louis had multiple kids, his sons would rip the Carolingian Empire apart, fighting for each other's pieces of it. And eventually, 3 different states would emerge. One in northern Italy, one in what is now France, and one that would become the Holy Roman Empire. Something that would be cemented with the crowning of the second Holy Roman Emperor, Otto I by the Pope in 962, and this set the stage for what would be the norm for the rest of the medieval ages. France on one side, the Italian north doing its own thing, and the Holy Roman Empire being a very large, but much more decentralized power in the heart of Europe, which itself would undergo something called the Ottonian Renaissance, when 3 emperors all named Otto, Otto I, II, and III, would rule up until the year 1002, by which time castles were being built, universities were being established, and the High Middle Ages was beginning in earnest, coupled with the fact that France had been doing pretty well on their own as well. However, though, in that intervening period, between Charlemagne's crowning in 800 and the rise of Otto I in 962, what was going on then? Well, put simply, Western Europe, fresh out of the Dark Ages, would be put to its first truly great test. And that test came in the form of the Viking raids. Yeah, about that. Let me roll this video back a little bit. Remember when I mentioned the monastery at Lindisfarne in England? Well, in 793, the island would be attacked by Viking raiders who came out of nowhere, burnt the place down, took monks as slaves, killed a lot of people, and stole whatever they could, vanishing back into the open waters. And a message was sent out from Lindisfarne, telling people of what was coming from the north, and they were not prepared. After that, from around the year 800 to the year 1066, the Vikings would savage all of Western Europe, which just so happened to be ripping itself apart as the descendants of Charlemagne squabbled over the imperial crown. In fact, Paris would be taken multiple times by Viking raiders, and so much money would go into the pockets of these barbarians to just get them to stop, to get them to give up whatever city they were currently holding hostage. Now, I did mention that the Viking raids ended in 1066, but in reality, they had largely wrapped up by the beginning of the 900s, because that was when Rollo the Walker would surrender to the French king Charles the Simple, and in exchange would be granted land in northern France, lands that would eventually become the Duchy of Normandy. And as I previously mentioned, these Normans, the descendants of the Viking Rollo, would, under the leadership of William the Bastard, later to be known as William the Conqueror, take over England, and thusly complete the process started by Alfred the Great, bringing a definitive end to the transitional period and finally ushering in the High Middle Ages in England. Furthermore, this would happen even earlier in Germany, with most of the last Vikings being pushed out of East Francia by around 885. So I'm willing to mark down the era between 911 and 962 as the end of the transitional period between Dark Ages and High Middle Ages, 911 being the date Rollo became the Duke of Normandy, even though he didn't formally use that title, and 962 being the coronation of Otto the Great as the first of the 3 Ottos, ushering in the Ottonian Renaissance, and finally re-establishing the title of Holy Roman Emperor. So now we had France, the Holy Roman Empire, and England as unified bodies, with the Reconquista in full tilt as previously mentioned. Also, interestingly, in 1096, the County of Portugal would be re-established after Henry, the son of the Duke of Burgundy, would marry the daughter of the King of Castile, one of the independent Christian states in the north of Spain, and be made the Count of Portugal. And it would be his son Alfonso who would become the first king of an independent Portugal in 1139. So we can see the groundwork for that being laid as well. So, yeah, that's about it. When the Roman Empire fell in 476 AD, Western Europe absolutely did enter a dark age. Learning slowed to a crawl. Architecture was a throwback to a simpler time. Small nations across Western Europe could only muster paltry resources and couldn't devote themselves to any wider, grander pursuits. Meanwhile, religious conflicts between pagans, Nicene and Arian Christians ravaged the continent, and all the while outside invaders simply could not be repulsed. But this would finally start to come to an end in the 700s, and Europe would be finally free of the Dark Ages at the dawn of the 9th century with the crowning of Charlemagne as the Holy Roman Emperor, where he would usher in the Carolingian Renaissance, promote learning, aggressively expand the power of the papacy, and oversee the reintroduction of great works in Western Europe. And while there would be a stopgap with the turmoil of the Holy Roman Empire after his death and the Viking raids, things would finally clear up with the end of Western Europe's second Renaissance, the Ottonian Renaissance, in 1002, the final definitive end to the Viking raids in 1066 with the Battle of Stamford Bridge, the conquest of England by William the Conqueror that same year, and the establishment of the two oldest universities in Europe, that being the University of Bologna in 1088 and Oxford University in 1096. Furthermore, the oldest stone castles in Europe would be built around this time. Château de Loches in France would be built in the 9th century. Château de Chaumont would be built in the 10th century. Reichsburg-Cochem would be built in the year 1000 AD. Hohenwurth Fortress in Salzburg would be built in 1077 AD, and William the Conqueror would see to the construction of the mighty castles of Windsor, Warwick, and Rochester. And that's not to mention the era of gorgeous cathedral building kicked off by Charlemagne with his masterpiece in Aachen. By this time, Western Europe had finally, definitively, come out from under the shadow of the Roman Empire and out of the Dark Ages, laying the groundwork for strong centralized states that were so powerful and organized that they could, by the year 1096, launch the First Crusade. And regardless of what you think of the Crusades, you can't deny that they were an honestly insane logistical effort. But honestly, I think all of this can best be summed up by a monumental event at the tail end of the 700s, where, on a cold October day in 732, the Battle of Tours would take place, where Charlemagne, grandfather to the man who would lead Western Europe out of the Dark Ages, would look at an oncoming Umayyad army and decide then and there that Western Europe was not meant to be a backwater. It was not meant to be the ugly stepchild of the civilized world, either ignored completely or spirited between better empires, be them the Romans, the Carthaginians, or the Umayyads, and caused all the world to stop and think that maybe, just maybe, Western Europe was worth a damn. Whew. Well, that's finally wrapped up. So, as you can imagine, this video took a little longer than I expected and was a fair bit harder than I had hoping it would be. But I really hope it paid off, and I really hope you guys appreciate the effort I put into this one. So, if you can, please drop a like and a comment for the algorithm. It really means a lot, and share this video around if you can. It really helps the channel grow. So, until next time. This video was made in collaboration with my art director, Love Chaotica, and my sketch artist, Dragonerd, who graciously stepped in to draw the thumbnail and the splash art for this video. Also, this video would not be here were it not for the support of our wonderful consoles, Zamurai, Nick Kordaluski, Battle Brother, Knight, and Boomfrog. Furthermore, we can't forget our wonderful censors, Rion Outrom, Frisco Corvinus, Jan Timo Lobner, and Lorenzo. Also, a very heartfelt thanks to our praetors, Blackstop, Kumrate, 3x01, Zephyr Brown, David Nori, High Marshal Guts, Demonique, Fran, Omega Chris 112, and Fey Evolved. Plus all of our Tribunes of the Plebes listed here and all of our Questors and Adiles not listed here. Without your support, these videos would simply not be possible. Thank you all so very much, and I will see you in the next video.